There we go. Perfect. Thanks everyone for your patience. Like I said, welcome to Quick Claims webinar from data to delivery, mastering NDIS plan utilization. We hope today to give you some helpful tips and tricks to ensure that you can both support all the participants that are under your care and also set yourselves up for financial sustainability in the long term. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. And we pay our respects to the people, the cultures, and the elders, past and present. A few points of housekeeping before we get into the webinar proper. We would love you to ask questions as we go. You've got the chat functionality in Zoom, so feel free to pop any questions you might have in that chat. We will endeavour to answer them as we go, but rest assured, if we don't get the chance, we will have a Q&A of 15 minutes at the end of today's webinar where we'll answer any of those outstanding questions. If you do have any technical issues during the course of the webinar, please do email me at tris@quickclaim.com.au. I will be recording today's webinar so we can send it to you after the fact, but we will also be sending you a copy of the slides. So check your inbox for that. You should receive it in the next couple of days. I suppose we should introduce ourselves. Ben, I might let you go first. Let the good folk know who you are and how you came to Quick Claim.
Great, thanks. For those of you who had good fortune not to have met me yet, my name is Ben Roswick and I'm the COO at Quick Claim, which is just a fancy title for a person who is responsible for looking after all the things that the CEO doesn't like doing themselves. My background is actually in mathematics, with particular focus on statistics, and that's one of the reasons why I love the NDIS, because as we all know, there's no shortage of numbers and statistics that come out of the agency, and one of the most useful statistics to anyone in the scheme, whether you're a participant, provider, or the agency itself, is plan utilization.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. And my name is Tristram. I have worked in the NDIS since its inception in both marketing roles and as a director of a number of small to medium-sized not-for-profits. But I am just as important as anything else, an NDIS participant. So I live and breathe it. And this has given me a deep, deep passion to take what is a very complex, sometimes bureaucratic system to navigate and turn it into something much more simple, so providers and participants can get the very most out of it. So I also I love my Powershare football, which is a mixture of futsal and go-karting. So if I'm not working, you'll see me on the court playing that. That's a shameless plug. There you go. Thanks, guys. In terms of today's webinar, we will be exploring, obviously, plan utilization. What is best practice before going into some of the regulatory changes that impact plan utilization for yourselves going forwards, as well as looking at a bit of a case study around what plan utilization looks like, as we said, in best practice, as well as looking at obviously the key ethics and privacy considerations that are applicable to plan utilization. Obviously, there's a lot of data that we're obtaining for participants, and so ethics and privacy is a key element to that. So that will take us about half an hour, and then we will be, like I said, having a 15-minute Q&A at the end, where you're more than welcome to ask any questions that you might have. So let's kick things off proper and firstly define what exactly we mean by plan utilization. So when I refer to plan utilization, I simply mean that an NDIS participant is using their funds within their plan at the right pace so as to avoid overspending and underspending. within your day-to-day jobs, you have no doubt discussed overspending in quite some detail. It's the thing that we probably think about most often when we're talking about plan utilization. So the simplest example I can give is I was rather foolish in breaking my leg while I was holidaying last year. As a result, had to employ two support workers and realized very quickly because of that I was exhausting my funds and was tracking towards overspending. So not utilizing my plan as I should be, and had to do things in the background to bring that back into balance. The second one, underspending, is something that we talk about a little bit less often, but it is just as important for participants in the long term. So, as we might know, if we get to the end of our plan and we've not exhausted our funding, there's a portion of money that we've not used. What we've seen anecdotally, particularly myself, is that the NDIS then won't fund us at our next plan assessment to the same amount. They'll basically cut that from our plan. So it's really important that we get as close to possible to our funding target so that we're using our funds as they're intended and we can achieve all our goals as outlined in our plan. So that's sort of the participant lens. But as we sort of pivot more towards what this looks like in practice for you as providers, plan utilization is very much about helping participants get the most out of their NDIS plans, which in turn gives you guys the certainty that you're able to invoice for service delivered. So you know that you delivered a service and there's funds within that plan so that you can invoice. And this allows you, as we'll explore a little bit more in detail later on, help the participants reach those goals they have within the plan. So the question is how you can utilize plans. Well, it's all about getting certainty using data obtained by APIs, which is the perfect segue to throw to Ben, who is far more knowledgeable and skilled to talk about such things. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Tris. Can I just confirm, Tris, that you're sharing the slides, that sharing the presentation?
Oh, I am. Is it not showing for everyone?
Thought a couple of people just mentioned that it's not sharing. Maybe you want to just stop sharing and share again just to make sure it's
Let's do that. As I said, there's a couple of uh, difficulties that we've had with Zoom today, so I appreciate everyone's patience on that. And I'll do that again. Is that coming up for everyone now?
Um, all right, well, let me dive into it anyway. So obviously we want to talk about how we're going to use the NDIS APIs to calculate plan utilization. And for those of you who are perhaps not so familiar with NDIS APIs, it's basically a way of communicating with the NDIS through an application programming interface. So that's what API stands for. And that's something that's provided through the Digital Partnerships Office of the NDIS, which is like a little agency that sits within the NDIS. So if you want to gain access to those APIs, and in theory anyone can, you need to apply for a license to do so. It's a little bit of a rigmarole to do that. You need to be ISO certified, for example, and a couple of other things. But the alternative is to go through what's called an aggregator. And an aggregator is licensed to provide the data to other providers, not just themselves, but to other providers too. So that's a slightly easier way to get access to those APIs. Once you've got access, you also need to get consent from your participants to access their data. So this is something that is more often being done now when participants are signing their service agreement. So it's part of that process to go through the consent form and make sure that you're getting consent to see their plan data. But if you haven't done it at inception and they're already your participant, it's something that you should definitely look into. So the key data points that you need from those APIs are around the sort of total remaining budget as well as the plan start and end date. So those are the only real data points you need in order to be able to calculate plan utilization. Because what it is, in essence, it's a very simple concept, is just the amount of, or the fraction of the budget remaining, marked against the percentage of the time remaining in that funding period. And I'll go over what I mean by that in just a moment. So you also need to be aware that because it's such a simple calculation, it has limitations too. So it's not context aware, for want of a better description. So in the example that, Tris just mentioned, where he had broke his leg and needed to consume his budget that much faster, that obviously wouldn't be reflected in such a simple calculation. So even though that one simple number can give you something very powerful, it also needs to be taken, not necessarily with a grain of salt, but it needs to be interpreted for what it is. All right, I might just jump on to the next slide. I think that's back to you, Tris.
It is back to me. Thanks, Ben. So it's good just to look at the key principles to why plan utilization is so important as to what Ben outlined. And there's four that we just very quickly want to run through. So obviously the first is around enhanced participant outcomes. So that's about ensuring that you're aligning your services more closely with the needs and goals of the participants that you support. So within my NDIS plan, I have the goal that I want to live as independently as possible in my own home. My service providers will have that noted within their own care plans for myself. And so they obviously need to ensure that they have the data to track that I am as closely as possible meeting those goals and those outcomes so that I can, as we want, live as all participants do, as independently as we can. The second key principle that's worth noting is just around increased provider efficiency. So this is about ensuring that you have better resource management, which then reduces the administrative burden. So, it's a rather complex thing having, CRM systems that collate all this information that, tracking the funding of the participants to make sure that they're not overspending or underspending. And so by doing this plan utilization, it means that you're reducing the burden of your admin team and it can more closely monitor, that they are meeting those participant outcomes, as I mentioned. The third really important element is just around improved compliance and reporting. So demonstrating the value and the effective use of funds. So again, this aligns with those participant outcomes. We all have goals that we strive to work towards. We have funding that then allows us to achieve those goals. So whenever we go to plan assessment meetings, we need to demonstrate that we're using those funds effectively. As participants, and then on the flip side, as providers, there's obviously as registered providers a whole lot of benchmarks you need to meet come audit time and those sorts of things, and this all plays into the one hand. So that compliance is so vital. And then the fourth one, which I touched on very briefly, early on, is just around business sustainability and growth. So ensuring that you can make long-term strategic decisions. An example of this is you might recognize that a participant is exhausting their funds. And so in the long term, your staff, as an example, might not be able to work with that participant while they're going through change of circumstances or those sorts of things. So you can actually have a broad picture around where you might need to reposition your staff and strategic decisions around where you also need to hire staff and those sorts of things. So those are the four key principles. You all no doubt live and breathe this, but it's important just to reiterate what those mean for you in your day-to-day practice.
Cool, thanks, Tris. Just before I dive into this slide, I noticed there's been a few questions. So first thing is, if you do have questions, you'll see that there's not only a chat function, there's also a Q&A function. So make sure you type it through the Q&A function, and we'll answer those questions as soon as we can. Then to answer your specific question about does this include PACE clients? The answer is yes. So you can calculate plan utilization based on service bookings, based on their PACE budget. You can even do it for a ROC versus actual delivered. So the answer is that the concept applies to all participants, and you can get the data for any participant for whom you have consent. Right, okay. So just looking at this chart in front of you now, before everyone starts squinting to see the tiny numbers and the writing on the chart, don't worry, I'm going to explain it all to you. You'll see on the vertical axis, we have the amount of budget remaining for a particular funding period. And on the horizontal axis, we have the amount of time remaining in that funding period. So each dot on the plot represents a particular participant's plan utilization rate. And the diagonal line through the middle of the chart represents the sort of optimal utilization rate, where you're consuming both time and budget at the same rate or in perfect harmony, which all sounds very zen, but you know, being a statistics nerd, that's just my way of enjoying what I'm seeing in front of me in terms of numbers. So I've circled two groups of numbers on the chart. So we'll start with a red circle. This is the group of participants who are underutilizing their plan, which means that they still have a lot of budget remaining, but not much time left in which to consume it or to spend it. The blue circle represents a group of participants who are overutilizing their plan and have only got a small amount of budget left, but lots of time remaining before their funding is renewed. And I think, you know, obviously Trish has explained those two concepts of under and overutilizing, and I'll go into, you know, the consequences of that as well in just a second. If we want to move to the next slide, Trish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So, you know, now that we know how to acquire the data and we sort of maybe to some extent know how to plot it or to sort of visualize it, the next most important, we come to the most important step, which is how we're going to use that data. So there's quite a few areas within a typical organization that benefit from having plan utilization data available to them. Ideally, you want the managers or frontline staff to be aware of whether budgets are being under or overutilized so that they can optimize the service delivery. So they're the ones who are actually going to take action and change how your services are delivered. And that means obviously communicating with participants to explain the situation, explaining that, hey, you know, we're not delivering the level of service that we could be under your either a service agreement or under your budget, under your plan. And also, if perhaps we're delivering services too quickly, we need to take action against that as well, either by adjusting the services or by, you know, if you're the person liaising with the NDIE or with the agency itself, then you need access to that data so that you can go and ask for a variation in someone's plan, so that, you know, as I said, if you're overutilizing, you can then go and make the case for them to have their budget extended or their plan extended. And you can only really do that if you have the data in front of you. If you can be saying, hey, you know, we've been delivering services at this cadence. Obviously, that means that if we're going to run out of budget, you know, before the end of this funding period, and we need to vary their plan. So lastly, the billing team also needs to be aware of the pace at which budgets are being consumed so that they can change their financial forecasts and act on, you know, their claims and invoices accordingly. So if plans are being underutilized, for example, you'll know that your future revenue forecasts maybe need to be adjusted lower. And similarly, if you're overutilizing, if you've got participants overutilizing their plan, you need to get ahead of that to avoid incurring bad debts where you're delivering services, but there isn't the budget there to fund it. You know, that's not always the case, of course. You know, sometimes you can plead your case to the agency with manual invoicing, but no one really wants to be in that situation. So it's best to have the data in front of you so that you can get ahead of exactly that situation. The other point that I've put up here is that, you know, again, it's all well and good to have the data and to be able to use it, but you need to know how to interpret that data. I touched on it earlier that obviously the data itself is just numbers. You need to have context around that to really give it meaning. You need to be able to understand, hey, if we're using it, if we're using budget at this rate, what does that actually mean? For example, you know, does that mean that we need to deliver more or less services? Does it mean we need to vary their plans. And of course, the other consequence of underutilizing that we haven't mentioned yet is that when it comes to plan renewals, right, the first thing that they're going to look at is, hey, you only consumed 70% of your budget in the last plan. We're going to shrink your plan down to that number. And I think, Chris, you've had experience of exactly that, right? That's something that is a real problem that you don't want to be underutilizing if you think that there's a chance that you're going to need more in the future in particular. Okay. So let's just go over the regulatory changes. And if you're anything like me, your heart probably skips a beat or two whenever you hear the term regulatory change. No one likes to hear that. But unfortunately, it's a term that we're all too familiar with in NDIS. Sometimes I like to think that there's a whole bunch of legislation writers out there who have just discovered ChatGPT and they're writing new legislation just with the click of a button, which is why it changes so often. But so what are these changes that are coming? So the first thing is that you need to be aware that funding periods are going to become variable. So we're all used to a 12-month funding period where, okay, here's a budget for the next 12 months, and that applies uniformly across all budgets. But that's actually going to change, and we're going to move towards a shorter budget. It hasn't been confirmed, but it's probably going to be a quarterly funding period, which means that each quarter you'll be allocated a certain amount of that budget to spend or a certain amount of that total plan size. You'll be able to roll over some of that, but certainly, that's going to change how we approach utilization and make it even more important to keep track of. Support's also going to be grouped into what's being called funding components. So a funding component can have its own budget, which is going to be called a funding component amount. So you might have a situation where, for example, daily living has a quarterly budget and assistive technology has an annual budget. So we've got this idea that budgets are grouped in different ways and along different periods. So it's just getting a little bit messier. In theory, obviously, the agency has justified this by saying we want to prevent people from overspending their budgets, or we want to help people smooth it out, which is why we're having more funding periods or shorter funding periods. But of course, in practice, that means that there's going to be more of an onus on providers and plan managers to keep track of these things and ensure that spending is at the right cadence. So even though we know that these changes are coming, we haven't actually been given a strict time frame for when they're going to arrive. What we do know as an API aggregator ourselves is that they have already made changes to how the APIs work, and we're already testing those changes to be able to see what quarterly budgets are available against annual budgets and how it's all going to work. So they've already done a lot of the work to implement the changes from a technical point of view. So I imagine that actually rolling it out, it can't be too far away. So really, what am I getting at with all of these sort of, explaining all these changes is that there's going to be more things for you to keep track of. And it's going to be harder to keep track of them without a good system to help you do that. Okay. Right. So ethics and privacy considerations. So just like with any data, it's important to remember that you're handling personal information here. And again, obviously that's not new to any of you, but here it may be that there are different people who need access to this data. And because you're providing it to a wider community, you need to take into account, what are your privacy obligations under the law, under the privacy principles. But also just from an ethical point of view, you need to be careful about who we're sharing this with. And is that, something that the participants would be okay with? Is it to their benefit to do that? Similarly, we need to think about when we're building the systems to be able to make these calculations or keep track of them, that there needs to be adequate security measures, cybersecurity, measures in place to ensure that only the authorized users can access that information. And then again, that's something that obviously a lot of you would be familiar with. But because, again, this is going to be going to maybe a slightly wider or different community, you need to make sure that the systems that you're using to distribute that information are adequately protected from a cybersecurity point of view. Lastly, when gaining consent to get a participant's data, we need to make sure that there's transparency over why we're doing this. Okay, we need to explain to participants or their guardians why it's going to be beneficial to them and to providers to have that data available. And I think, hopefully after sort of today and after, I'm sure, having thought about it yourselves before as well, it's pretty obvious that that data can be to participants' benefit. It's just that we need to make sure that that's communicated properly to make sure that it's a true win-win situation. Cool. Back to you, Tris.
Thanks, Ben. So we've obviously covered off a whole lot of information, and if nothing else, we sort of wanted to condense and bottle all these thoughts into three key takeaways for all of you. So the first one is just the simple fact that accessing real-time plan data is only possible with NDIS API connectivity. So Ben had that graph that he showed earlier around overspending and underspending. When I broke my leg, I did all this manual stuff to find out that I was overspending my NDS funds. But the problem with this is that it's very, very flawed. A lot of human error involved. I can make a few errors when it comes to statistics. I'm not as skilled as my colleague Ben. So the simple fact is that NDIS API connectivity means that you have real-time plan data as it exists right then and there, which is so important when it comes to plan utilization. The second key takeaway is just the simple fact that plan utilization data can help inform decisions at all levels of your organization. So I gave the example a little bit earlier, the fact that when I was when I broke my leg and was using my funds to bring my budget back into equilibrium, I had to talk to the agency, and they had to obviously shift carers elsewhere while I was trying to not use as much funds. So this plan utilization means that the agencies and other NDS providers can have real oversight around staff, where they're positioning those staff, whether they need to hire more staff in a particular area, and that's really important for long-term decision making. And then the third takeaway is just that both participants and service providers benefit from plan utilization data. And I've provided my participant lens throughout this webinar to give insights, but it is just as important, if not more so, for providers to allow them, like we said, to make those strategic decisions for the long term, to make sure that participants can meet those goals so that they can get the funding at their next planning assessment to continue striving towards those goals, whether they change them, adapt them, they have that funding there so that they can live the lives that they want to live. So that's our snapshot on plan utilization. We now want to open up to any questions that anyone might have, how this works in practice. And I got one privately, Ben, which I'll throw to you straight away, which is just around how long might this process take to set up the sort of dashboards that you need, and the sort of licenses you might need to make this workable.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. So as I mentioned, there's a couple of ways you can go about getting API data. One is to apply to the Digital Partnership Office directly, which means that you need to sort of go through a couple of hurdles around getting cybersecurity clearance. But if you manage to do that, you obviously get direct access to the APIs, although you need to obviously then be able to understand how to use those APIs. So you need someone who's technically literate and available to do that. The other option is to go through an aggregator. So there are a few aggregators out there. An aggregator, or at least a good one, will provide you with software to present all of this data for you. So it won't, it's not just a matter of giving you access to the APIs. This will all be done for you. So obviously that's a bit of a shortcut, but it means going through that aggregator to do it. When you've got that data, whether you're sourcing it yourself or otherwise, and I should mention that, in theory, you could go and do this on the portal yourself just by going into individual participants, seeing what their budget is available, or by getting it at the inception, when you first sign that service agreement, and manually tracking it. But, obviously that's very difficult. The advantage of the API is that we'll give you real-time data for multiple participants at once. And you also then need to be able to update that against your spending as time goes on. So when you've got hundreds or even thousands of participants, that becomes quite a challenge, obviously. So having a proper database where you're able to update that data continuously, that can be quite a challenge to develop that. And then to have a visualization tool like a Power BI or a Tableau to help you sort of really gain insights into what that data is doing, to be able to easily identify this is the group of participants who are under or overspending, and then to have automated actions on the back of that to make sure that that data is getting to the right people's hands, and they know what to do with it. That can be part of the challenge too. So there's lots of steps towards not just acquiring the data, but to be able to use it effectively. Some of those steps can be shortcutted by going through a software provider. But for sure, it's a doable process, but it's hard unless you've got dedicated resources to really be able to focus on it.
Well said, Ben. We've got a couple of other questions that our very knowledgeable CEO, Amir, has been answering. But just to recap a couple of those for everyone, if you can't jump into the Q&A, can it access plan data for both self and plan managed participants? Amir has answered that, with participant consent, you can see the complete budget for PACE participants. Does the API also supply SDA funding info? Yes, for both SDA and SIL providers, they're eligible to see the SIL SDA portion of the budget. We've also got a question from Carly just around, can we get the graph based on approved quotes and service booking versus total plan funds? Just because they're not obviously the only provider that's accessing the funds, invoicing participants. Ricky, my colleague has answered, yes, you can, depending if you're pulling the data source from your CRM or in QuickClaim's budget tool. We can create at QuickClaim those graphs based on that those requisites. And then we
I just
also
might add one more thing to
yeah, of
Ricky's
course.
response there, because it's a good question from Carly about that. One advantage of using the APIs is that when you query the budget remaining amount, you're obviously finding out what is in the budget, regardless of whether you are the only provider providing services. So even if there are other providers also providing services, so for example, if it's plan managed, you will have visibility into it, like the whole budget remaining. So again, whether you're consuming the service or someone else is consuming the service, you see the actual budget remaining. And that's another good point, really. It's like if you want to avoid a situation where it's not just you delivering services too fast, but where someone's consuming their budget away from you, the only way to do that really is by going to the APIs and querying that data in real time.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ben. We've got a question from David. Can a third-party vendor, as an example, a dev partner, have access to the NDIS API for integration delivery?
Yep, absolutely. That's a good question, David. And actually, if you want to reach out to me separately after this webinar, I can sort of help talk you through how that would work. We at QuickClaim do have a couple of CRM partners who are consuming the data through an aggregator, through ourselves. So there's definitely something that can be done.
Perfect. We have another question. Do participants need to provide two consents for PACE and accessing PACE data through API?
So I'm not 100% sure about I remember seeing the consent form, but I'm pretty sure, fairly confident that the answer is no, that it's not two separate consents. but I will definitely get that confirmed, Mayhak, from Amir after the webinar, and I'll send you back a definite answer. But I think the answer is no, it's just the once.
Perfect. We've got I can see Amir typing a response there, so I'll update people once he's answered that as well. We've also got another question. What website do we get the data of the participants funding from, assuming that consent is given?
Yeah, good question. So that's what I was going on about before. If you want to be able to gain that data, you need to go through the Digital Partnerships Office to apply for an API license. As I mentioned, it's not an easy process. It's actually, there's very few license holders out there because there's quite a high level of cybersecurity clearance that you need to be able to access it. It's easier just to go through an aggregator. Obviously, QuickClaim are an aggregator ourselves, but there are other aggregators out there. If you just Google NDIS API aggregator or NDIS APIs, you'll find a list of people out there who can help you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ben. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A chat. I think we've got an answer, just to clarify, from Mia, who confirms it is one consent for the PACE budget, but there is also a separate process in the NDIA to set up the relationship between the participant and the provider. So one consent, but there is that additional process that needs to be undertaken as well. Just looking through, no more questions seem to be forthcoming. So we might wrap it up there, Ben.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess one thing to mention is that if you do have any more questions that you haven't had a chance to ask here, or if you prefer to ask us in person, obviously reach out to either Tris or myself. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions offline.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining QuickClaim's first webinar of the year. We hope it's been insightful. We thoroughly enjoyed delivering it to everyone today. Like Ben said, please email us if you do have any questions. But I will be emailing the slides today or tomorrow for those that jumped on a little bit late. And we'll also be sharing a recording later on as well, so you can go back and watch this at your own leisure. But thank you again. Thanks, Ben. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Tris.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.